U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action commissioned a report called The Potential for U.S. Agriculture to be Greenhouse Gas Negative, which was authored by an independent group of 26 leading research scientists and peer-reviewed by the National Academy of Sciences. This report, which was published by the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology, or CAS, is a literature review. We will include a link in the description for you to learn more. In this report, it featured 5 different opportunities, and we have covered each opportunity individually on Farm Food Facts with one of the many authors involved in the study. Today, our focus is back on efficient energy use in agriculture. We are joined with one of the researchers involved in this study. His name is Dr. Tom Richard. He is retired from Penn State University in 2023 and was a professor of agricultural and biological engineering, specializing in bioenergy and bioresource engineering. Now, to get started, Tom, can you provide a high-level overview of your involvement and the opportunity on efficient energy use in agriculture?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity, Joanna. So I've been working on energy and sustainability in agriculture for 3 or 4 decades now. And I've done that from a variety of different perspectives, trying to understand how do we reduce the various environmental impacts of agriculture, but also how do we make sure agriculture actually contributes to our society in as many positive ways as possible. And it turns out that in the energy space, there's really lots of opportunities on both sides of that. So in terms of energy efficiency, we've done a lot of work with myself and graduate students trying to quantify what are the different energy components of agriculture, mostly within the farm gate, what's happening on the farm, but also all the inputs to agriculture, some of which are very energy intensive. And then also, what can we do with the resources on the farm in order to produce energy, both for farm use, but also for the broader society?
I want to read a line from the study. It says, agriculture's greatest energy demand comes from fuel, fertilizer, and irrigation systems. As a farmer is thinking about their farm, what would you tell them to focus on to reduce energy use in those areas from a basic to a more advanced approach?
Sure. Well, I'll start with fuel. So that's an expensive part of any farm operation. And for crop farming, it's primarily liquid fuels. So we're talking diesel, sometimes gasoline, and many farmers are now using biodiesel, which is a farm product. Of course, it's mostly processed off farm, but some farmers make their own biodiesel products. And increasingly, we also have renewable diesel, which is a slightly different chemical processing and is even more compatible with diesel equipment. For gasoline, of course, ethanol is another substitute that can be done and produced from farm resources. And so both of those are really good opportunities for farms to actually use some of their own resources in their energy uses. In some cases now, we also have natural gas tractors, and I'll talk more about renewable natural gas, but that's another opportunity to use farm resources. The biogas that's produced on farms from anaerobic digestion can be burned, but the tractors are requiring typically a higher quality gas than that. So it needs to be upgraded to the quality that's adequate to get the power for those kinds of equipment needs. Now that's the fuel side, but the equipment operations actually, there's a lot of choices that farmers make in terms of what their tillage systems are, what their planting systems are. Reduced tillage, which has many environmental benefits and soil health benefits, is a way to reduce the energy requirements from tillage. So there's a conservation program and an energy efficiency component to that. The next, well, I'll switch gears a little bit from the crops. So the rest of farm operations, and particularly livestock operations, there's oftentimes a lot of electricity involved. So that's another area where farms can think about their fuel source. Renewable natural gas and biogas can be used to produce electricity. Biogas on farms is an opportunity that many dairies have taken advantage of. But there's also solar and wind And agrivoltaics is getting a lot of interest now in terms of how do we actually find compatible ways to produce solar, not just on the roofs of barns, for example, but also in fields, and doing that in compatible ways with cropping systems. There are some challenges there which we could get into, but that's another opportunity. In terms of fertilizer, now this is really interesting. When we look at the various crops that we grow in the U.S., it turns out that the energy that's embedded in fertilizer that's used to produce that fertilizer off the farm is actually the single biggest component of the energy required to produce that crop. It's greater than the fuel in almost all cases. And so that's kind of a surprise to a lot of people, but it turns out that that's really the main cost of fertilizer. Our nitrogen fertilizer is made from nitrogen in the air that we breathe in big industrial factories with a lot of fossil fuel. And it's a very energy intensive process. That's particularly the case for nitrogen fertilizer. But there's also a lot of equipment used in the phosphorus fertilizers we use. So there's an opportunity there to be more efficient about our use of fertilizer. Again, that has a host of environmental benefits, including water quality and economic benefits. So learning how to be more effective in getting the maximum crop growth from the fertilizer we have. Also looking at trying to reclaim nutrients on the farm, more effective use of manure nutrients, for example, so that we can reduce the on-farm or the off-farm fertilizer inputs. Those are all ways to enhance the energy use in fertilizer. And finally, irrigation requirements. Now, not every farm is in a dry area, and so if you're not using irrigation, it's maybe not as relevant. But for those areas that do require irrigation, that's another really big energy footprint. And people know it's costing them money to provide that water. There's also environmental aspects to it in terms of water quality or water quantity shortages, aquifers being depleted across the western parts of the Midwest, Ogallala and other places, and other parts of the country. So looking at those irrigation systems and moving from the systems that are maybe more traditional, flood irrigation, even the large circle sprinkler systems, those and linear circular systems, those do waste a lot of water. So thinking about drip irrigation and other energy efficient opportunities there, and doing an analysis of what are those cost trade-offs, because they require greater capital investment. Right. So anyway, but again, every one of those things has an opportunity. They're site specific, and every farm operation should be looking at its energy, their energy system, and finding ways to save money and improve the environment.
Right. You just gave us a whole handful of options and things that people should consider. Let's look at fertilizer, and let's talk about it from like a farmer perspective. What should they specifically be looking at? Should they be looking at planting more legumes? Should they look at variable rate? Should they like application methods? What are some ways that farmers can look at reducing some of their fertilizer use or maximizing what they have?
So those are two great options. So legumes, of course, are capturing nitrogen from the atmosphere. They do that with solar energy rather than fossil energy. It's a totally different process than the way we make chemical fertilizer, but actually it's coming from the same source. It's the nitrogen from the air, and it happens right on the farm. And so those legumes are a way to capture that nitrogen and get it into the soil with that fantastic synergy between the photosynthetic plant and the microbial processes that actually use some of the plant byproducts to produce that nitrogen fertilizer. So that's a great option. Now, it works probably most commonly well if you have a nitrogen crop like a legume in a rotation on a farm. Sometimes that's a year-to-year rotation, like, for example, summer soybeans and summer corn. But also many farmers are doing things with longer rotations with alfalfa, for example, or clovers in a pasture situation to build up the nitrogen over a period of years and then put it back into annual production. But also winter crops and winter legumes are a great opportunity to use those cover crops to both to preserve the soil, but also to bring in some nitrogen in the winter. So there's a good opportunity there to think about those legumes. You mentioned precision agriculture. So this is a huge opportunity, and it's one that ties into many other opportunities for energy efficiency and actually profitability in farming. So we oftentimes historically have thought about our fields as pretty homogeneous. So we're growing one crop on a field, and we typically will think about one fertilizer application rate. But any farmer knows that there's areas of the field that produce really well and other areas of the field that don't. And those areas that are not as productive don't need as much fertilizer. And so equipment that is now available to change the rate of application, to tie that into the geographic information systems and geopositioning systems to be able to change the rate of application as the equipment is going over the field provides a huge opportunity to be more efficient and target that fertilizer application rate to the right rate at the right place for maximizing the crop benefits.
Right. Well, Dr. Richard, I feel like you answered my next two questions, but if you want to get more specific or if you're more passionate about a certain space, please share more about it. But what needs to be done to make us successful in energy efficiency use in agriculture?
Well, I want to shift gears a little bit. So again, there are a whole bunch of strategies for trying to be energy efficient, but our chapter also talked about energy production on the farm. And those things can happen in good synergy too. It turns out that American agriculture uses about 2% of the total energy consumption in the United States. Doesn't sound like a whole lot, but agriculture is spending a lot of money on that energy. And many farmers have learned that they can produce energy on their farm or produce energy crops on their farm. And that's been a really important part of both corn and soybean production for decades now. But there are also other crops that can be used. In the last decade, we've seen a pretty impressive expansion in the use of livestock manure for biogas and now renewable natural gas production. And so those are a handful of ways that we can actually use agricultural systems to both produce energy. But interestingly, those systems all also capture carbon from the atmosphere. Photosynthesis always does that. And thinking about how do we actually create more of a circular economy of nutrients on a farm, but also an energy production system through those strategies turns out to be a really big opportunity. One of the things that I think we haven't really taken advantage of yet is how we can think about agriculture as a way to take more carbon out of the atmosphere and use it to substitute for fossil energy, not just with some of those liquid fuels that we use today, but getting beyond manure to actually looking at other crops for biogas production and renewable natural gas production. So this is something that we're working on right now with some major companies, trying to find ways to think about winter biomass crops like cereal rye, perennial grasses like prairie, to vastly increase that potential. Right now, if we look at the typical waste materials that we use to produce biogas and renewable natural gas, we could well, just to back up a second. So here's an interesting statistic. Today, our electric grid has about 40% non-fossil energy in it. That's not all solar and wind. In fact, very little of it is right now, less than 10%. Half of that 40% that's non-fossil is nuclear, and another 10% is hydroelectric. But solar and wind are gaining fast. So we've got one of our energy grids in this country is 40% non-fossil. The other grid is our natural gas grid. and that is 99.5% fossil right now. So renewable natural gas is about 0.4% of the natural gas grid. And if we took advantage of all the waste we have from food waste and sewage sludge from municipalities and manures, we would only get that up to about 4%.
Wow.
But we can get with crop residues and dedicated biomass crops like harvesting cover crops and perennial grasses, we can easily get up to, our estimates are 17 to 20% of the natural gas grid. Now that's not a total substitution, but it's a big player. And there's an infrastructure already out there that we can leverage and a grid, and we've got the technology. So that's an example of where we can actually use on-farm resources to advance farm profitability and sustainability for our entire society. So that's one example. There are others, but I think how do we make it successful was your question. And I think it happens by working together and finding some ways to partner with on-farm opportunities and also off-farm entities. I've worked in several states over the course of my career, and I think the state level was where a lot of this can happen right now, with working with groups of farms, groups of utilities, state government and incentives. Quite a few states are now looking very hard at how to put together more supportive policies for some of these ideas. And that's a huge potential, both at the state level, but also nationally.
Right. Thank you for sharing some of those numbers with us. You can just feel the excitement, I feel like, in this conversation and in your voice, that there is a lot of opportunity there. Let's talk about technology and tools. We talked about precision agriculture, but what technology or tools can play a role in helping with energy efficiency in agriculture?
Yeah, well, precision agriculture is a very concrete example of the opportunity to use information technology more broadly in agriculture. And I think when we use the term precision agriculture, we usually think about our cropping systems, things like variable rate applications, et cetera, looking at yield monitoring, for example. But there's also a whole area in precision animal agriculture of how do we actually understand individual dairy cows, for example, and what their feed needs are, their nutrition, and also their health needs. But we can even go beyond that and try to look at farm integration, livestock and crops, look at landscape level opportunities. One of the things that some of my students have worked on has been to try to understand some of the landscape opportunities for looking at subfield level management changes. Now, I mentioned earlier that farmers know that there's areas of a field that aren't as productive. It turns out in many parts of the country, and we've done this at a state level in both Iowa and Pennsylvania, so pretty different regions, roughly 20% of annual cropland is not profitable on a 5 to 10 year span. Now, that's because of crop failures, either because of drought or flooding on, again, roughly 20% of typical fields that happen every 3 or 4 years. Farmers, of course, are optimists. They couldn't farm if they weren't. And most years, they're going to have a decent yield on those marginal parts of a field. But with that kind of information technology and tracking how those yields behave over time and understanding the very high cost of replanting those fields if there was a flood in the spring, of not being able to harvest because the crop never matured, the money lost in that and trying to farm those acres with annual crops is huge. So there's an opportunity to actually restructure some of the way we grow to the way we manage our fields to find that 20% and move it into something that's going to be more resilient, whether that's a pasture or a biomass crop or something else. Um, so, so those are that's just one example of how do we use this information technology to try to get more efficient and more environmentally sound agricultural production.
Two more questions for you, Dr. Richard. So you've mentioned weather being a possible challenge. If you want to touch on that more, or what other challenges farmers might face in this space.
Yeah, well, I mentioned both flooding and drought, and it is no surprise to American farmers that we're having more frequent experiences of both of those things, right? So that's part of the downside of climate change, and it's happening, and it's well documented, and people are realizing it in their own fields. So thinking through, like, how do we actually build more resilient systems so that those flooding and drought events do not cause as much disruption? How do we actually, and there's lots of work that the seed companies are doing on breeding resilience into some of our crops. Drought resistance, there's several products available now for that. But how do we actually think about our cropping systems as well? Where we plant, I've talked a little bit about that. When we plant, how do we build up soil health so that the soil itself is more resilient, both allowing water to drain more quickly after a flood and also holding more water during a summer drought. And actually building up organic matter in soil and soil carbon is a way to solve both of those problems. So I think there's how do we actually rethink our systems in agriculture? And I think one of the challenges for farmers and ranchers is they're already running a complex system. It's probably the most complicated business to run I'm aware of. And and a lot of the technical service providers that they have, whether that's an agronomist or a veterinarian or whatever, they're specialists. What I don't think we have as much of as is the support to look at the system of the farm in an integrated way so that we can actually find those opportunities of synergy for resilience, efficiency for energy and all the other costly inputs to farm to make a more profitable system as a whole.
Right. Really interesting. Last question for you, Tom. What do you want people to take away from this opportunity focused on energy efficiency use in agriculture?
Well, two things. One is that energy use in agriculture is a major cost for farmers. And so spending some time to focus on the energy efficiency opportunities, reducing energy needs, and also what are the on-farm energy resources is very important for the bottom line, and every farmer should do that. Second is agriculture in general. So this is at a policy level, but also farmers working together have a huge opportunity to build new markets for energy that's more sustainable and that's domestic energy that creates more jobs per unit of energy than any of our other energy resources, and that can actually improve our rural economies. So I think thinking about those on-farm energy opportunities to serve society is a huge thing for us to work on together.
Right. There's been a lot of positive energy in this interview and in this conversation. We've been talking with Dr. Tom Richard. He is retired from Penn State University in 2023 and was a professor of agricultural and biological engineering, specializing in bioenergy and bioresource engineering. Well, we hope that this conversation brought value to what you're doing, got those gears turning on maybe some different ideas that you can be implementing on your farm, ranch, or business. USFRA plays the critical, important role of creating opportunities for collaboration, information sharing, and solution development for the full agricultural value chain. We appreciate your time. And if you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please subscribe and rate us on your favorite podcast app. Tune in again. I'm Joanna Guza for Farm Food Facts. All right, Tom, I thought that went good. Any hesitations?
No, I mean, tripped up a little bit on a few places, but if it didn't bother you, it doesn't bother me.
No, it was perfect. Let's do the bonus question now. All right. So the bonus interview now in 3, 2, and 1. Welcome back to Farm Food Facts, brought to you by the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action. I'm your host, Joanna Guza. While we have our guests on the line, we want to get their insights on the future of agriculture and what they're keeping a close eye on. Our guest, Dr. Tom Richard, was on an earlier episode talking about his involvement on a focused study called the let me take that back, was on an earlier episode talking about his involvement focused on efficient energy use in agriculture in a commissioned report from U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action called The Potential for U.S. Agriculture to be Greenhouse Gas Negative. Now, Tom, with this bonus question, I'd like you to answer this question. What areas are you keeping an eye on that will have a positive and or negative impact on the future of agriculture?
Great question, Joanna. So I think I want to go back to the title of our study, which is the opportunities for U.S. agriculture to be greenhouse gas negative. And I want to unpack that a little bit. So we talk a lot about greenhouse gas emissions, and many of our activities, both in agriculture and in societies at large, are putting carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide into the atmosphere, and they're driving a really important challenge. Farmers and ranchers are most exposed to the weather. They've been fortunate for the last few centuries to have a period of relatively compatible weather, and it's getting worse. So in terms of risks and challenges, how do we actually deal with that? A lot of the focus has been on building resilience into agriculture, but greenhouse gas negative, in the title of our study, is actually an opportunity to make climate better, to get it back to what our parents and grandparents experienced. And agriculture has the biggest opportunity to do carbon negative activity that we have in our society because of photosynthesis. So here's an amazing fact. Plants take up 10 times as much carbon dioxide from the atmosphere every year as all fossil fuel emissions combined. If we could figure out how to harness just 10% of that photosynthesis in a more constructive way to keep that carbon dioxide that the plants are already captured in the soil, in products, and substituting for fossil energy, then we would solve the climate challenge. And we can go beyond that 10% to actually store carbon again, building up soil organic matter to increase soil health and resilience, building biomaterials and bioproducts out of plant-based carbon, and really start to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere in agriculture rather than putting it in. So that's the big opportunity as I see it. Right now, there's a $1 trillion industry that is growing to try to solve climate challenges, and agriculture's got some of the biggest opportunity and is still pretty quiet and not very organized in terms of how do we monetize and take advantage of that economic opportunity.
That answer is from Dr. Tom Richard. He is retired from Penn State University in 2023 and was a professor of agricultural and biological engineering, specializing in bioenergy and bioresource engineering. We appreciate your time. And if you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please subscribe and rate us on your favorite podcast app. Tune in again. I'm Joanna Guza for Farm Food Facts.